Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, and regulatory landscape and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me on the desk at the Nasdaq market site, we have Diego Justiniano. He's the CEO of Exomad Green, as well as Trenton Spindler, Chief Growth Officer of Puro.Earth. We're here to discuss voluntary carbon dioxide removal markets known as CDR. Exomad Green represents the supplier side and is the world's largest biochar producer and a leading carbon dioxide removal supplier based in Bolivia. Puro.Earth, no stranger to Nasdaq, is the world's leading carbon removal registry and standard in which Nasdaq holds a majority stake since 2021. We're here to discuss the annual Carbon Unbound Carbon Dioxide Removal Industry event. It's organized this week in New York City. It gathers several hundreds of business leaders, investors, buyers, policymakers to shape the future of carbon dioxide removal. Compared to previous events, Trenton, what has changed this year and comes across in the discussions that you've been having with your peers in the space?
It's a good question. I mean, I would say what's different this year is realism. I think there's been a little bit of a global rebalancing. U.S. policy support has slowed down slightly, but we are seeing quite a bit of acceleration in European markets, whether it's CRCF, whether we see momentum in Japan, Singapore, Australia, or other global entrants into the market. So I would say the rebalancing is good. The feeling now is less about waiting for perfect policy and more about action. I think we have some phenomenal suppliers from the Puro ecosystem here that are showing you could be durable, investable, and have a cross-border solution that isn't necessarily dependent on the pen stroke of a compliance policy, but can complement one as it matures and grows into the market by being in the voluntary market today and de-risking investment. It's fantastic. We're getting to be real, not just speculative.
Diego, from your perspective as a supplier compared to past events, how is this year different? How is it maturing?
Well, that's actually a right perspective to put it. I see more mature market, so we see a much more variety of people in the general CDR ecosystem in this trade show. It's amazing to see a lot of buyer traction, a lot of more mature suppliers right now on the market. There's all the general ecosystem, DMRVs, all the different people that actually make the market happen are there. So I see basically a much more mature market.
Yeah, so broader representation.
Yes.
Yeah. Trenton, let's take a step back for a moment here. Why carbon dioxide removals? Why are they important? Can't companies just lower their carbon footprint organically, as an example, through business activities? How big of a problem does this contribute to climate change if we're not focusing on CDR?
Yeah, I would say cutting emissions is essential, and I'm going to say that again. Cutting emissions is essential. 80 to 95 or 90% have to happen by 2050, but that's not enough. I mean, to be candid, we still have residual and historical emissions, and the only way to deal with those, residuals being what we can't reduce, and historical being what's happened obviously before, is through carbon removal technology. So I'd argue it's no longer optional. Every IPCC scenario that takes us or keeps us under 2 degrees Celsius requires gigaton, not megaton, gigaton scale in removals. I actually saw an Oxford report that was recently put in the market that said we need somewhere between, I think, 7 to 9 billion tons of CO2 removed per year by mid-century. So I'd say, yeah, it's a big problem. And if removals aren't there, we're going to have a bigger problem to solve.
For context here, how can you correlate that to how much? I mean, you can't see carbon dioxide, so what does that mean?
It's, I wish I could use football fields and maybe like zoo animals.
Right.
But when you think about it, I mean, the volumes that we're talking about, when you start to think of like space and how far things are, say, to the moon, it's really hard for us to conceptualize because it is such a big gap and big distance. And I think the easiest way to understand it is it's going to require every single person in the financial markets and across a global economy to help come together and solve this, which is what you asked at Carbon Unbound. We're starting to see this global footprint, decision makers, regulatory players, financiers, large banks, and more take a seat at the table because they know this is a big problem that requires collective action, that requires a lot of people to talk about it, to conceptualize it, and make it tactile and real for the average person who may not understand the scale and the size of the problem and how much has to be done to accomplish it.
And Diego, Exomad, the world's largest producer of biochar carbon removal credits, how did the company start to utilize biochar carbon removal methodologies, and how does carbon capture happen in practice? Another way of asking this.
Sure. So basically, our background on the company is we are the largest wood exporter of Bolivia, and in the wood industry in general, we saw tons and tons and hundreds of thousands of tons of waste being generated. So we always were thinking what to do with this waste. And we found in biochar the perfect solution that basically solved two main problems. One, that waste was being incinerated in the past and it created massive amounts of contamination. And secondly, we can do something not only good for the environment, but also good to help the local people over there, because biochar, it's actually a soil amendment and it improves the soil tremendously. It has tons and tons of benefit that we can just go over and over. But how does the biochar capture the carbon? Basically, the tree, there's what's called the carbon cycle. Mm-hmm. So the tree, during its life, basically captures the carbon dioxide and remains during the tree. And when the tree is either harvested or it just dies naturally, then that carbon that was being captured, it just gets released onto the atmosphere. So what do we do with the biochar? With the biochar, we pass this waste through a pyrolysis system, which is basically heating at very high temperatures and for a determined permanence inside with an absolute absence of oxygen. And we just manage to carbonize this material and capture the CO2 so it becomes inert and it doesn't basically react with the soil or wherever we are putting that biochar as a definite sink site.
So when you capture it, where does it go? Can you use it in other ways?
Yes, it actually remains inside this biochar. The biochar is basically a certain or specific type of charcoal, which we actually use it for soil amendment in our case. So what do? We apply it in the soil. And not only it captures the carbon dioxide, but it actually improves the soil fertility. On average, we have hundreds of studies that we have been doing, and it improves between 15 to 30% yield for the farming community where our factories are located.
And biochar is the most common CDR removal methodology, and a majority of it has been certified under Puro.Earth. How do you see the role of biochar evolving in the next 5 years? That's something I can understand, and how it helps the environment organically. Are there other promising growing methodologies?
Yes, I absolutely. I mean, biochar is not only one of the most widely adopted, I would say, removal methods to date, it's also one of the most promising methodologies in the market, and with Exomad Green's leadership and others, I think it's going to continue to scale enormously. It's also recognized by that IPCC I mentioned as a durable solution. That means it has over 100-year and soon to be much more permanence as a metric from the scientific community, meaning it sticks around for a long time and solves this problem for at least 100 years, if not more. And I'll mention that we at Puro did have and will issue the most biochar in the world. We started the first methodology in 2019. We updated it in 2022, and we actually are going through a consultation right now with emerging science. So not only do we have these methodologies, which are the ways that this biochar is produced and how it tracks and accounts for all the carbon removal, we continue to update it on an ongoing basis with partners like Exomad and others to make sure it's significant, relevant, and the most rigorous way we can execute on it.
And I'm sorry, Diego, what is your view of the role of biochar in the future, and how important does the role of CDRs play in allowing this growth?
Also, I think that biochar, it's crucial right now in developing the CDR industry, because although there are many different methodologies or many different ways to capture carbon dioxide, most of them are still being developed. So there's technology that needs to be developed to be able to, so it can be deployed at larger scales. However, biochar technology is available right now. What we need is tremendous amounts of waste that are all over the world, and biochar can start delivering today, which is what we actually need for the climate and for the problem in the general world right now to be solved.
And Trenton, we've spoken about the Puro standard on the show a number of times. What kind of requirements do suppliers need to have to ensure the quality and reliability of their role with carbon dioxide removal?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be blunt. There's quite a few, but that's intentional. Like, we intentionally have quite a few standards. I mean, it's by design. High integrity removal really needs, all these things to be fungible, verifiable, and bankable. And we actually call our carbon removal certificates CORCs. It's a nice little acronym that we came up with. And they represent 1 ton of durably removed CO2. And these are issued only after a third-party verification body validates against the Puro standard. And to achieve that, there's a lot of things. I won't go through the list. There's an arduous list. I'm sorry, but I think it's great for the industry in that there's methodologies grounded in science and measurable standards in durable removal. There's rigorous monitoring, reporting, and verification. You'll hear MRV more and more over the time and over decades. And finally, as I mentioned, we have ongoing updates to the methodology and science. This isn't a stagnant solution. This is something that we're progressively learning and improving upon to make this more durable, more permanent, and to increase the ability for financiers and investors to put more capital into this market to expand it quicker and solve the problem faster.
I mean, of course, it's a business that is so, an industry that is so heavily dependent on the data that you're extracting from this, so it makes sense that you're more stringent with your methodology and your standards to be able to support the industry.
Absolutely.
At the end of the day. Diego, let's talk about some of the challenges here, because it seems obvious that this is good for the environment, not just in Bolivia, but globally.
Exactly.
What are the key challenges and opportunities that Exomad specifically faces in the carbon removal market?
So I think that the key challenges is basically deployment, To deploy a facility like the ones we have, which we have 2 operational facilities, are tremendous in size and the amount of waste that needs to be processed. So there is a logistical challenge involved in that. And for this business to work, you need to have 3 main components. A tremendous amount of logistics. To be able to get the inflow of raw material, you need to have an infrastructure which is very, very enormous and big to be able to handle those quantities of raw material and being able to process and do the biochar. But also you need a third part which is key, which is another tremendous logistics to be able to apply that biochar in what's called a sink site, which is where it's going to be, where it's going to stay permanently for the next 100, if not thousands of years. So that's the key challenge. And in terms of opportunities, I think that in the world, we have enough waste everywhere, not only in Bolivia, in the US, in Europe, in all emerging markets specifically. So we have tremendous amounts of waste. And what needs to happen is actually, there's a tremendous opportunity for a wide range of suppliers like Exomad Green, anywhere else in the world, to take a leap of faith. We are proving as Exomad Green that this is a realistic market, thanks to Puro, the methodology, and all our customers that actually trust us. And basically, they need to take a leap of faith. They need to make it happen and solve not only the waste problem, but also capture carbon dioxide. And it's also a business as they will make it happen.
Trenton, let's address the challenges facing the carbon removal industry overall and how that can be addressed. What can be done to grow the market to better address climate change?
Yeah, we at Puro.Earth, I would say we're making real progress, even as the market rebalances, as I mentioned previously. But there's 2 things that are critical, I would say. One is demand certainty, as we talked about, and the other is supply scale, which is what you're executing on. On the demand side, I'd say we're seeing encouraging signals in the markets. Governments are stepping up with procurement commitments. There are governing bodies, things that we already have heard in the market, like SBTI, science-based target initiatives, that are indicating potential use of removals for residual emissions, I mentioned before. But those are mostly medium to long-term signals. What we need now are really short-term buying commitments. Those are from corporates, financial institutions, climate funds, and others that accelerate that deployment and trust. At the same time, we need to scale up supply, as we discussed. And to do so, that requires emerging technologies and more mature ones to obviously continue to grow. But there's early stage. And this all comes to the other side of the coin, which is what does that take? And really, that's investment, right, to get there. And that's what unlocks this, right? It's a nascent market, but it's no longer speculative. I mean this. This is what we saw at the event. It's now a critical part of the climate solution. It's acknowledged globally. So we need more companies, we need more governments, and we need more buyers to invest early and often and build those economies of scale today and in tomorrow so that the cost curves goes down. This will help with market education, and it'll make it a narrative in the market where we understand this isn't something that is just a finger in the wind. This is a real activity now with real financial rails, real integrity, and something that's going to be here for decades to come.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the education piece, because I also think the industry needs to understand what audience they are speaking to, or who the audience is that they're speaking to. I cover this for a living, and it still can be challenging to understand this at scale. So from the policy perspective, what would you like to see to support the growth of the CDR market?
I see a lot of positive momentum, honestly, from the positive policy market. I would say there's, as I mentioned, critical to medium and short term, I think, indicators right now in the market. The EU, as I mentioned, is launching what they call the Carbon Removal Certification Framework, which is CRCF, you'll hear again and again, and that's going to define and really certify high quality removals like what we see here. SBTI, I mentioned, had their proposal around residuals. But just to illustrate this point, I think that's really interesting. There is the EU ETS, which is the emissions trading. Yes, if we had 0.4% of the EU ETS allocated to removals, just 0.4, not 4%, 0.4%, that today would create roughly 5 megatons of demand in 1 year. So this isn't something that's hard to execute on. It just takes momentum and a convergence between the voluntary and I would say in carbon compliance markets. And then obviously you combine these two areas together and you get clear and aligned guidance from players like SBTI, others like ICVCM, which are governing bodies that are trying to figure out the buy and supply side of what to do on the removals market. And I think you start to get to a point where companies have their North Star, know how to operate, and investment is unlocked. Policy has to activate this, but we also need a free market solution that can build the rails for when policy and compliance comes.
All right, and Diego, I want to go back to the early stage funding options because it is a capital intensive business, as you had mentioned before. What needs to happen in terms of agreement and market commitments for carbon suppliers in general?
Well, I think that it's critical to have long-term offtake agreements because that brings basically credibility onto your project. Today, for example, we announced a landmark agreement with Microsoft, Exomad Green and Microsoft for 1.24 million tons of carbon removals and over a 10-year period. That, for example, is a bankable contract. So with agreements like this, just to give an example, we can go to the bank, we can negotiate. It's not every single bank out there, but there are specific banks that are willing to and understand the business, and that brings a clear solution for financing. So yes, I do think that the most critical part for financing is to have agreements and especially long-term offtake agreements.
Yeah, I mean, that's remarkable. Congratulations on
Thank
the
you.
announcement with Microsoft. Trenton, how do you see the carbon removal market developing in terms of pricing and demand?
Yeah, I mean, pricing is a constant theme in the carbon removals market. High prices are there for certain types of CDR technology on this early curve of adoption. But I would flag that most assume that's the case for every single pathway, and every pathway being every methodology or project type. But I'd mention there are index-linked price products actually operated by Nasdaq that help to really educate buyers and understand where eventually the forward curve is going. So the reality is not all forms of CDR are the same, not all prices are the same, and as obviously you mentioned, I would say we really need to closely scrutinize how offtakes work because those agreements are unlocking those economies of scale earlier and allowing buyers today to secure lower pricing long term and de-risk their COGS, their regulatory pressure, anything in between. So yes, prices could be perceived as high today, but that's only if you're looking at a very fractional amount of the volume. Go secure a long-term agreement and you'll be able to negotiate very, very good pricing and secure your volume and your needs for both the voluntary and compliance market today for decades to come, as Microsoft did today, obviously, in this 10-year agreement.
Yeah, and Diego, to wrap up here, Trenton had made the point before that some of the goals are aggressive that need to be met. What, in your estimate, realistically, how fast do you think the CRD market can grow?
Well, I think that it's a mix of different technologies right now. Right now, the realistic technology that can deploy megatons of carbon removals, right now it's biochar. But we actually need all the other technologies out there like BECS, direct air capture, and enhanced rock weathering, all of them, to be able to scale and to reach what we need, the gigatons scale. So how fast can we do it? I think that in general, we should be able to have significant numbers by 2030, and we hope that we can actually contribute to all the goals by 2050. But for that, we actually need not only the commitment from all the corporate world, but also the policy.
Yeah, all right. Appreciate both of your insights. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.